and welcome back to Scylla's Polecats, or welcome to Scylla's Polecats, and welcome to the first review of 2024. Exciting! I've said in the previous video where I talked a bit about my goals for this year that I want to do more dedicated reviews for books because I just think that's a lot of fun and I think content like this is really interesting. And we're gonna see how well this goes, but I chose a very different book than I have talked about so far for the first review, which might or might not screw me over, but we'll see what happens. And the book that I'm talking about is The Brilliant Abyss by Helen Scales. I read this last year, which sounds like it's been aeons, but it actually hasn't. And the reason this is different from most books that I've read so far, and also most books that I've talked about on this channel so far, is because The Brilliant Abyss is in fact a non-fiction book about the deep sea, from a marine biologist and writer. And I'm gonna structure this review a bit differently because I do feel like non-fiction should be reviewed differently than fiction. So without further ado, let's just dive right into this book. So first and foremost, what I think we should focus on when it comes to nonfiction is not necessarily how it's written, but how informative it is, how well researched it seems, and how much information you can gain from this book in particular without having to do additional research to that. The third question can be a bit hard because more often than not, I tend to pick up nonfiction books about topics that I already have some kind of idea over, so my idea of having no knowledge diving into this book might be very different from someone who's truly never been interested in the topic or has never seen anything about the topic before. For instance, I used to watch a lot of sea and also deep sea documentaries when I was a child, so there might be knowledge that I have that someone else who's never done this before doesn't. But I think that's what I'm going to be focusing on when it comes to nonfiction book reviews. I have, I think, like 1 or 2 more planned, specifically when it comes to nonfiction books. So, yeah, let's dive right into it. So first and foremost, I got this for my birthday, and I was really, really excited to have it. It wasn't that expensive, which is already a plus in my opinion, because I feel like specifically when it comes to nonfiction, the prices can be staggering, which is very scary as someone who just wants to be informed about certain topics. So that's a plus already. I really enjoyed the cover as well, like it really piqued my interest. It has a few of the sea creatures that the book also talks about on it. And both the title as well as the subtitle are very informative about the subject of the book. The book, as I said, is called The Brilliant Abyss, but the subtitle reads True Tales of Exploring the Deep Sea, Discovering Hidden Life, and Selling the Seabed. Which means the subtitle already gives us the impression that this is not just going to be about all the nice creatures you can find underneath the ocean, but it's also very likely going to be about the impact that humanity has had on the deep sea and life that exists down there, where we know we haven't really discovered that much. I really enjoy this about nonfiction, aka when the title tells you more about the book, instead of just giving you like, yeah, this is about the deep sea, like that's great. What angle are we going for though? So I really enjoy this about the title as well. Now, another thing that I find very important about nonfiction is more often than not people will read nonfiction not necessarily, you know, consequentially. What I mean by this is they're probably not going to read chapter 1 and then chapter 2 and then chapter 3 unless that is the way they want to consume it, but a lot of nonfiction usually is what people read, well, they choose and pick their chapters, right? Nonfiction, more often than not, is also just meant to be very informative to you as the person who's reading it, and more often than not people read it when they want to do some sort of research. If that is for fun, for academia, for school, doesn't really matter. So what's important for nonfiction books in my opinion is that the nonfiction book, not only through the title but also through chapter headings, tells you specifically what the chapters are about. So if you're looking for a specific topic, you can pick and choose and don't have to go through over 300 pages. as someone who regularly reads nonfiction for academia, I know that it can get exhausting having to read a lot of academic or academic-esque literature. So a 300-page book for academia is very, very different than a 300-page book you read for fun. That's just what it is. And this is another point that I really enjoyed about this book, because the entire thing, as you can see kind of here in the table of contents, the entire book is split into 4 different parts as well as an epilogue. Every single part has a different tagline. So the first part is called Explore, for example. The second one is Depend. Third is Exploit. And 4 is Preserve. So we already know what kind of structure we're going for here. First of all, we're going to explore what's happening in the deep sea in general. Then we're going to talk about what's dependable on whom and why. Then we're going to talk about the exploitation that humanity has already put into place when it comes to the deep sea. And the last part is going, or very likely going to be talking about how to preserve what we have, in this case when it comes to nature. Every single part is also split into several chapters. This kind of depends on how long the part is. Also very nice. The average chapter length is between 20 to 30 pages roundabout. And as we can see, the chapter titles do tell you a bit more about what's going on. In the Explore part, for example, we have something like Caught in a Jelly Web. So if you're like a tiny bit knowledgeable about sea creatures, you might assume that this is going to be talking about jellyfish, Medusae to be precise. Another chapter is in a chemical world. So we're probably going to be talking about chemicals down in the deep sea, chemical reactions, all that good stuff. I do really enjoy nonfiction with chapter titles like these, especially if it's just one book and not, for example, a collection of essays. Because as I said, more often than not, we don't read nonfiction books chapter by chapter. We read them whenever we think the information might be interesting to us. Wonderful. So the setup of the entire book already, in my opinion, makes this a good source. But we haven't really gotten into the book yet, have we? As I've said, Helen Scales is a marine biologist and a writer, and I do believe that especially the part about her being a writer played a big role in how I perceived this book, because I personally think that The Brilliant Abyss is a very accessible source in a lot of ways. Yes, it is, well, for a non-fiction book, it's not necessarily short. It's about 300 pages, minus the sources. So like the last page I think is page 94, 294, so about 300 pages, give or take. However, as I said, the chapters are relatively short. The writing is a standard size, as you can see, and I personally found the writing style to be very accessible. The way that Helen Scales designed this book, or designed the information that she's giving out in this book, is she interspersed personal anecdotes where, for example, she found out about a specific phenomenon, which she then goes on to explain in greater detail later on. She starts with anecdotes and then goes over the scientific details, what she's actually been talking about, usually also complete with the history behind it, as in, for example, when these things were discovered, who was the one discovering them. So she's not just listing off deep sea creatures, but she's also talking about how, for example, they relate to each other, how they relate to humanity, if they do that in any case, where the information came from in the first place. Sometimes when it comes to the historical anecdotes, I would say, or the historical history behind how certain things were discovered, she also talks about the misconceptions that people had previously because they didn't have the knowledge that we have right now. That made it also very interesting to me personally, because I'm really interested in how scientists started discovering things only to then notice, well, maybe we were wrong, which is always very funny. The writing style itself also seemed very accessible, at least to me. I've read academic sources that were way worse than this, let's just say it like that. Helen Scales tries to be accessible to people because she wants people to be reading this book. And the reason this is such a big deal is because the one thing that we're usually missing as a link between science and humanity, or science and humanities, is the fact that science is not often that accessible to people who haven't at least studied it a little bit. It's very hard for certain scientists to express themselves in a way that is accessible to the public, which is unfortunate because the public kind of needs those information. Or, in this case, it's maybe a bit more of a want for information than a need for information, but for example, when it comes to medical information that scientists are trying to give out to the public, the message often becomes very muddled, because scientists don't necessarily know how to approach a public that has no knowledge of how information gets processed within the science community. I have a big issue with that. I used to study biology for a bit, and I have a very big issue with that, especially when it comes to, as I said, you know, making information accessible to the public, which is why I really appreciate the way Helen Scales did it in this book. There were a few times where she got a bit repetitive, mostly because she wanted to stress some sort of information, or because an anecdote that she used previously also made sense to be used in a different context. I'm completely fine with this. I think repeating information every once in a while is also very important in order for people to process it properly, especially when it comes to non-fiction sources that are longer than an essay. Let's just say it like that. Like, essays should try to be as clear and concise as possible. Non-fiction books, in my opinion, are allowed to repeat contents every once in a while to remind people why we're still talking about them. So, I do believe that Helen Scales' background as a writer, on top of being a scientist, in this case a marine biologist, really helped to make this book accessible to people who might not have as much experience listening to scientists talk about their various subjects. Big plus in my eyes, honestly. I really love it when authors are able to do that. Now, another thing that I really enjoyed about this book, and I feel like it should be a given, but alas it is not, since this was published by Bloomsbury, we can assume that it is a bit more in the direction of what a lot of people like to refer to as popular science books, rather than science books. The difference is very academic elitist in some ways, but the difference essentially is that popular science books are supposed to be accessible by the populace, so by the people. And the other kind of academic scientific books are usually the ones reserved for scientific circles, more often than not because they are completely inaccessible to the public, either because they're behind a paywall, or because their language is genuinely inaccessible to people who haven't studied whatever it is these studies, books, essays, etc. are talking about. So, The Brilliant Abyss would very likely fall more into the category of a popular science book. However, and this is where I'm really excited, Helen Scales included every single one of her sources, every single one of her sources at the back. The sources within the text are marked by small footnotes, so if you want to hear more about where she got the information from, you do have to turn to the back of the book. As I said, the book itself, so the writing itself, is about 294 pages, then we get to the acknowledgements, and then we get to all of the notes. The notes in the back are also sorted by chapter. Every single chapter starts with a new first note, essentially, and every single one of those notes leads to a book, an essay. More often than not, these are online accessible sources that people can then also read further. And I really appreciate this, not just in the sense of maybe don't plagiarize other people, but also in the sense of the fact that this makes The Brilliant Abyss a perfect first source for people who are interested in the deep sea, what's happening down there, and what humanity is doing. But if they want to dive deeper, I'm so funny, into the materials and into the information available about this wonderful place, they can do so fairly easily by just basically starting off the notes that Helen Scales left at the back of this book. I am really appreciative of that as someone who has suffered from authors not doing that because I then had to do the research on my own. Of course, not all of the sources that Helen Scales names at the back of this book are probably going to be accessible for the entire public. I haven't been able to check that because I do have access to a lot of, for example, online journals as a student of a university in Germany. So I personally cannot fact check if you can assess all of these information yourself if you are not a member of academia. But I do think that the fact alone that there is pages upon pages of notes, like, we stop, give me a second, she stops giving us sources on page 342. That is basically 50 pages worth of notes, 50 pages worth of here's some further reading. She also includes additional resources at the back of the book, which are basically organizations campaigning to protect the deep, for example. There's reports on deep-sea mining and deep-sea fishing, which is something she talks about at length in the book as well. There's some film and television for the people who don't really like to read that much or who don't find information in, you know, a reading format that accessible to them. There's some music as well, which I find absolutely fascinating, and she also includes some more books for people who might be more interested or who would like to do a bit more research into the entire thing. I love that because, again, it highlights to me that what Helen Scales wanted to do with this book is to give people basically a collected point of entry into the entire field of deep-sea marine biology. It makes me think that what she wants is to educate people, but to also give people the ability to educate themselves even further than that. The Brilliant Abyss is basically a summary of everything that she has learned and everything that she has read and everything that she has seen, and she's handing that to the reader with a list of books, movies, YouTube channels, live blog pages that readers can check out after they're done with this book if they still want to have more information. Or if they're in the middle of the book and they find, I cannot pay attention to this, there's more resources at the back of the book. I really enjoyed that, and this alone is what made me give this book 5 stars, honestly, because I feel like it has truly done what it wanted to do, which is educate people on the deep sea, but also educate people on the dangers the deep sea is facing because of human interactions with it. Really, really loved it. Also, for people who do like visual things, there's some shots, like some pictures of deep sea creatures in here, which is really, really cool. It just shows you how many different organisms are down there and how they look like, which is really cool, especially for people, as I said, who are more visual learners than anything, or people who just want to look at pretty deep-sea creatures. Pretty might be subjective, but still, it's wonderful. Now, the content itself is also incredibly interesting because, as I said, Helen Scales is kind of combining a lot of different information about the deep sea. She starts out with talking about different creatures, then goes into the ecosystem itself a bit more and how everything relates to each other. For example, talking about hydrothermal vents, which are hot vents down there. Really fascinating stuff. She also does away with a lot of myths that people believed about the deep sea previous to being able to explore it a bit more. And since this book is also from, I believe, 2021, if I remember that correctly, let me have a very quick look. Yes. Since this book was published in 2021, a lot of the information, specifically when it comes to exploitation of the deep sea, is very much up to date to what we currently have, which is also great. As I said, it's a fantastic starting point if you want, for example, to get more involved into protecting the deep sea or into getting involved in protecting the seas in general, even though Helen Scales is very much focusing on the deep sea. A lot of what she says is applicable to the oceans of the world, essentially. So, yes, if you are at all interested in the deep sea, if you're at all interested in marine biology, but you would really like to go a bit more deeper than just talking about whales and dolphins, essentially, if you are at all interested in somewhat simplified explanations of very complex ecosystems down there that we with, you know, our human eyes cannot really see right now. I highly encourage you to pick up The Brilliant Abyss if this is at all anything that's interesting to you. I'm going to try and see if I can link some of the additional sources, especially to blog posts or YouTube channels, if I can link some of them down below, because I do believe that this information should be made readily available to as many people as possible if you want to inform yourself in ways that go beyond picking up a book, because, you know, you might not have the money for it right now, or you might not have the brain space for it right now, or, as Helen Scales also apparently very adequately noticed, you might not be able to learn a lot from books alone, which is completely fine, and that's why we have multiple ways of accessing information right now. So, yes, I love this book with all my heart. I think if you're at all interested in the topic, you should definitely pick this one up if you pick up anything at all. And once you want to do more research, there's a lot of sources. There's a lot of sources in here. So, yes, this was probably not that much about the actual, you know, content of the book, but I think that with nonfiction, it's very important to point out the difference in how to approach them versus fiction books. For the content, just very quickly before we end this rambling video, as I said, I found it really interesting. You're going to learn a lot of very fun facts, like for example, the one where there's bone worms in the deep who eat whale bones, and they actually found out that those whale bones are not the only bones these worms have eaten, because apparently they've been around since the dinosaurs. How's that for an interesting fun fact you can drop at a birthday party when you're bored? So yes, if you're into these interesting facts, but also if you want to learn more about the exploitation of the deep sea, and if you want to learn more about how we could maybe stop doing that, you know, that'd be great. I highly encourage you to pick up The Brilliant Abyss. It's wonderfully written. The author includes an incredible amount of sources if you want to inform yourself further on something, and in general, it was a surprisingly fast read. So, highly recommend this. I gave it 5 stars, and if you pick it up, or if you're interested at all, let me know in the comments down below. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience, and you will continue having a nice reading experience, and I will see you soon.